Hi, I am Jennifer Purcell, and welcome to my podcast, Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge, where we will discuss, discover, and learn more about the challenges and triumphs of those with NLD and other learning challenges. I do have a website for this podcast, and it is called livingwithnld.com. I also have a Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter account for the podcast. They are all under the same name, which is Living with NLD. I also have a YouTube channel for the podcast, which can be found by Googling the title of the podcast, which is Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge. I would like to tell you about a nonprofit that I use for my research for this podcast. It is called the NVLD Project, and I use their blog for my research. They are a nonprofit that is based in New York and is trying to get NVLD back on the DSM, and they provide many resources for people with NVLD on their website. I'll provide you with the website for them in the podcast description. All proceeds from the ads on this podcast will be donated towards the NVLD project. Please feel free to explore the other topics on the podcast, and hopefully you will learn something new from them. I hope you enjoy today's episodes.
However, we have also talked about the risks or the limiting nature of when someone is misdiagnosed, even misdiagnosed as being, for example, lazy or not intelligent, or even sometimes not misdiagnosed, but there has been, and again, there's some research to suggest this, that because there is this belief that learning disabilities are lifelong, there's a tendency for someone to have a limited view of what they're capable of.
Right.
This kind of learned helplessness. And this happens particularly in the school world, but for sure we see it in our adult world. You know, when people say, well, I'm not a math person, or I can't, I don't know how to do that. That's not for me. And this absolute fixed mindset of, well, I can't, I don't know how. And that's risky, and it's limiting, and it's not true. Now you, Jennifer, for lots of reasons that maybe we can't measure, you challenge that assumption. And you're a better person for it. And you creating this podcast to shift the conversation, you're really changing the lives of many to have that happen. It's the stigma. It's the stigma of what it means to have a learning disability. So I'm going to go back to when I said I'm in two minds about it, because the other side of the coin is, why does there have to be such stigma around learning disabilities if all it really tells us is there are these cognitive functions at play that are working way too hard, and through science, through this understanding that our brains actually are plastic, and I think this is the first time we might be referring to neuroplasticity. Our brains actually are constantly growing and changing, and we can actually harness that capacity for them to grow and change and improve our cognitive function and strengthen specific cognitive functions. Why do we have a stigma around learning disability? What's wrong with saying, this is my learning disability, or this is my current cognitive difficulty, or my present, today, I have a weakness in this particular cognitive function, because it's just a starting point. It's just where we are right now. And if we apply a growth mindset, if we apply this idea as you have, even without knowing, the Arrowsmith approach, or even without maybe even knowing this concept of neuroplasticity, but you questioned that assumption that your brain or mind was fixed. You challenged it and you won. You saw an opportunity to, yes, you had to work harder, and yes, you had to work differently, but you weren't limited by a diagnosis. So that's why I say I'm kind of in two minds about, the term learning disability or learning difficulty or even learning challenge and even neurodiversity. There doesn't have to be the stigma, not because, certainly because anyone with those terms still deserve, of course, respect and dignity and are capable, but also because it's just a starting point. So I think we might be coming to the conversation with a slightly different perspective, but I really see a lot of synergy between what we're saying, which is with more awareness and with harnessing our core ability to improve our reality, ourselves and our reality in life. It doesn't really matter what we're calling it.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, and it reminds me of a previous episode with my podcast I did on labels and
Amazing. I'll have to check that
um
out.
yeah, forget which year I did it in, but I I liked that one because, like you were saying, there is some oh, I forget what word you used, but there is some good or bad in labels, it's kind of like a double-edged sword, if you will.
Totally. Totally.
Um, and like, like the stigma you were talking about, there is that. But I think for me, before I had the label of NLD, just take that for example,
Yeah.
I think for me, I kind of felt lost at times of like, why am I so um, different, or why
Uh-huh.
is this challenging for me? You
Uh-huh.
know, I have an older brother, and I would always compare myself to him of, oh, he's so much better at math than I am
Mm-hmm.
when we were in school, because he was
Mm-hmm.
only 5 years older than me, and
Mm-hmm.
so um and or he another thing, he was better at writing than I was with
Mm-hmm.
essays, or when there was math and science, he was better. I'm like, okay, I couldn't help but do that. Um, and then when I got my diagnosis, like I said earlier, it was like a light bulb went off. It was like,
Uh-huh.
okay,
Yeah.
that's why those things are challenging.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and like you said, the understanding and the awareness is the key point of being able to, um, I think, just know more about yourself and be able to be like, okay, yes, this is true, but we can work on it,
Mm-hmm.
and we can make it be more um easier. And I think it also speaks to this um the spectrum that a lot of learning challenges have, like
Yes.
autism, um or I think to some extent all of them have a spectrum. I know NLD does. um
Absolutely, Jennifer. Let's agree.
yeah.
We all, right? We all have cognitive strengths and weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can see ourselves across life is a spectrum, learning and performance is
Right.
a spectrum, and we all fall somewhere along there. But we can even go deeper than that and look at these specific cognitive functions. There's, by the way, a great tool.
Mm-hmm.
It's on the, I'm going to share it with you, and then you can share it on your website. And it's a cognitive questionnaire,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a bit of a commitment. It takes about half an hour to complete, but you can complete it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a series of questions, and you can complete it for yourself or even or someone you love. And it's a cognitive questionnaire that actually produces a report. And that report gives you insights into the specific cognitive functions that are impacting your reality, your learning
Mm.
experience, your personal experience. Again, how you see yourself, how you navigate the world, how how you engage in the world through this
Mm.
cognitive lens. And exactly as you described, it can sometimes be the light bulb, like the aha moment that people are like, okay, especially when they're thinking about themselves or someone they know. Because particularly for those of us, you know, parents, teachers, spouses, friends, siblings, there's a tendency for us to look at the outcome, like the behavior or the performance or the achievement or lack of achievement, rather than what's underneath that. And a cognitive lens or this cognitive questionnaire can give you this insight into, okay, so this is why, this is why my brother uh, messes up with not showing up on time. It's not that
Mm.
he disrespects the importance of my schedule or my family's schedule. It's that it's much harder for him to organize his time or to
Mhm.
even do the math to say, okay, if I need to show up at this time and it takes me this much time to get there and traffic is, at this time of day, here's the quick calculation to do that. He's not trying to upset me. It's harder for him. So that cognitive lens, that understanding that these specific cognitive functions lead to these specific actions or reactions, I agree, Jennifer, can be a real game changer. And that's the first piece. And then I would love for all of us to again recognize that all of these qualities in our brains are changeable, and they're changeable throughout our lifetime. This was something, Jennifer, when you shared, some of your own thoughts about this work, about Arrowsmith's works. One of the things you asked was about the value of early identification, of understanding
Mhm.
someone's cognitive profile or learning challenges early on. And
Right.
it's definitely valuable for all of us. I'm sure you probably think to yourself, had I had my diagnosis when I was
Mhm.
younger, what kind of impact would they have? Now, some might say, well, no, it's, positive that I learned later in life because I was that much more motivated, for example, to
Mhm.
change my experience. Uh, that's a that's an optimistic view, but
Mhm.
certainly, the I would argue, and hopefully you agree to some extent, that the earlier you understand yourself and the earlier others understand you, the more likely to have uh, uh, the support and awareness that we all deserve. So certainly, given what tends to happen in terms of emotional and psychological impact of learning difficulties, the tendency to fall behind academically or even social skills, there's no question that the sooner we understand our cognitive profile, even the sooner we participate in a neuroplastic cognitive strengthening program, the better. But our brains are plastic throughout our lifetime. So, for example, I know people in their 80s that have participated in a cognitive program that has been designed to target and strengthen their cognitive function. So
Mhm.
it's, I think, valuable to understand ourselves as soon as possible, but also in the same breath to understand that our brains have this potential to grow and improve throughout life. So, you may feel like you were relatively late in the game to receive a diagnosis in college, but in fact, it's possible at any point not only to understand ourselves through a cognitive lens, but to improve or and change our reality, our cognitive functioning.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you bring up about when you get the diagnosis,
Mm,
because through all the people I've interviewed on this podcast, they've all gotten their diagnoses at different times in their
oh,
lives.
interesting. Hmm.
And, some people get it um, when they're, let's say, 10 or 7 or 55, I think was the latest.
Hmm.
Um, and for me, I'm kind of in the middle of all that at
Mm-hmm.
being at 19 when I got it. And so it's like, well, yeah, I could have gotten it earlier, of course. But I think for me, when I look back on it, I always knew I was different in some way. I didn't know what way,
Mm-hmm.
but I had a hunch, and it just got stronger and stronger, and to the point where I couldn't ignore it. And I was like, okay, I have to do something about this and be able to investigate and see why I'm having this hunch.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that
Mm-hmm.
kind of goes to, um, you know, um, why we want to. I was looking at some of the questions we've been talking
Mm-hmm.
about, some of them already,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of like the laziness or not trying hard. We've definitely been talking about that in terms of where that definitely is a harmful misconception, because neurodiverse people, and this is true of neurotypical people as well, we're not really lazy. It takes longer for us to do something that might be easier for somebody else or more natural for somebody else. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's definitely another misconception of like, well, um, they're going to grow out of it. Well, yeah, they can grow out of it, but they're going to grow out of it because they're working harder on that challenge.
Yeah. And I will say, in
Mm,
my experience, and I think, again, the research supports this, that folks like you, Jennifer, and even some of the guests on your podcast, they're the rarity. They're the exception.
mm,
They're through, extraordinary tenacity and uh, resilience and intelligence, uh, and family and community, and resources and privileges like that, have survived and thrived. But
mhm.
I respectfully, you're the exception, Jennifer. I know, uh, I know that you don't. I know that you know how hard
Yes.
you worked. You know more than anyone that it was probably blood, sweat, and tears sometimes for you to reach uh, the success and independence that you have. Uh, and statistically, I don't think we see that in the general population. I think we see far more struggle and
Mhm.
pain and shame and frustration, which again is why your podcast is so powerful and so important, and why I believe it's also important to have this understanding of a neuroplastic cognitive lens, that our brains are constantly capable of growth and improvement, because we know, Jennifer, your audience knows that life does not get easier as it
Mm-mm.
goes on. uh, it gets way more demanding. It gets far more
Mhm.
complicated. We have less people and places and things to rely on as we get older. In fact, people start relying on us. And I'm not talking about becoming a parent. I'm talking about being the child of aging parents, for example.
Mm.
I'm talking about being expected to be independent, hold down a job, and
Yes.
contribute to your community and pay taxes and
Mhm.
be a good citizen. Life gets way more complicated, way more demanding, cognitively demanding.
Right.
It is harder for our brains to function as adults. So the idea that we just have to work harder, I think, sometimes is a misconception,
Mhm.
uh, because some of us either cognitively don't have even the certain strengths. As I mentioned, it sounds like, Jennifer, I'd love to talk about for you to complete that cognitive questionnaire, and feel
Of
free,
course.
we can
Yeah.
have a chat about it, so we can analyze it together. Uh,
Mhm.
but my sense is you have some core strengths in some higher order functions of problem solving and of organization. And you mentioned auditory memory. So you're coping very well, but others don't have those strengths or a certain combination of strengths, or perhaps the sheer willpower to push through. So that's, yeah, I think it's important to recognize that it's more rare than not, and why we see particular. I work for an organization that delivers or offers cognitive programs to schools, primarily because schools tend to be where the most learning happens, where typically learning difficulties are identified or misunderstood. And schools right now are starting to build cognitive programs alongside their academic programs. And they are seeing some really interesting changes in their students who are doing both the cognitive program and academic program when it comes to their trajectory, their learning. So they're kind of changing the trajectory of someone with a learning difficulty tends to, as I said, fall farther and farther behind their peers. Academically, that's what's being tracked most carefully in school, of course, are those academic skills. And we're seeing students who are doing cognitive programs alongside with academic programs are they're being de-identified as either being at risk for having a learning disability or having a learning disability at all. They're no longer relying on resource support. So there's these kind of key shifts that are happening in the brain, and therefore it's changing their trajectory. So isn't it neat to imagine at these different stages of our development? And again, you mentioned, you were diagnosed at 19, some of your guests may be older, but there's these key stages in our lives, and they look very different at each point in our life, but we're still using our brains. Our brains are still at the core of, thinking about this period in elementary school where things move from concrete to conceptual in nature. Usually it's about grade 3 or 4. So anyone who's seeing, for example, their own child starting to struggle with something like fractions, that yes, their number senses, they can count forwards and backwards, but then when I tell them that 1/2 is bigger than 1/4, even though 4 is a bigger number than 2, their heads kind of explode. That's a cognitive function. That's a conceptual cognitive function that is responsible for it. When, there's a lot of conversation right now with social media having like this terrifying impact on teenagers. Well, there's a part of our brain that's responsible for thinking critically, for analyzing information, for making decisions based on our interpretation of information. Well, if our adolescents had a strong capacity through cognitive training, had a strong capacity to make judgments and decisions on the information that's presented to them in social media, even the ability to pay attention to what's important and ignore what's not, that's a very different conversation we can be having about adolescence, and rather than just taking away their phones, really giving them the cognitive tools, the intellectual capacity to just have a healthier relationship with social media or do other things. So I think at different stages of our lives, there's kind of some really neat opportunities to look at seniors, for example, who are facing the natural aging process. So building cognitive reserve through cognitive programming, either through just kind of good brain activity. And you mentioned some of the things that you have done to keep your brain sharper and healthier. And there's lots of great ways we can do that for our brains. We can sleep well and eat well and exercise well. There's lots and lots of research that show how important and valuable, worthwhile it is for brain health. And there's this idea of, okay, if we know what cognitive function in particular is contributing to our experience, then let's strengthen it. Let's target and strengthen it. So that was a long way of saying, I think there's lots of value in having an understanding of our unique cognitive ability. Number one, for awareness and compassion for ourselves and others. And that same lens can be used to think about, okay, what would life look like if I could have even stronger ability?
Yeah, I think you're right on that with having that understanding and what was I going to mention? Um, when you were talking about the aspect of parents taking care of their parents, I
Mm,
can I can empathize with that
you can relate.
because um my mom is taking care of her mom. She's 90, my grandma.
Wow,
And
incredible.
yeah, and so for me, I've seen my mom take her to doctor's appointments and
Hmm.
um drive her to, grocery stores or
Hmm.
eye appointments or whatever they may be, and making time for that in her schedule, and making time to make sure she's there to understand um, what the appointment's about, and help my grandma understand, of course.
Right.
Um,
Wow.
and so for me, that's helpful because then I'm like, okay, I'm taking note because I know I'm going to have to do that eventually for my parents at some point, of course.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, Jennifer? This isn't, I'll be very clear, this is not my area of expertise or knowledge, but it's interesting where medicine has
Mm,
been focused on our bodies. So we are
mm-hmm,
living much longer than previous generations have. Uh, but it's typically focused on our bodies and
mm-hmm,
our systems, our organ systems that help our body stay alive, but not nearly enough. I think research and awareness has been done on our brain's health and longevity, uh, because
mm-hmm.
it's there too. And some might argue that it's actually more important that we have a healthy brain compared to as we enter into our later decades. So,
Right.
as I said, not not an area of expertise for me. Although, as I said, we have seen seniors actually building cognitive reserve through cognitive training,
Mm-hmm.
because they themselves recognize, it's all well and good that I'm in my 80s and 90s and I'm still around, but unless I'm meaningfully engaging in the world with my
Mm-hmm.
brain, um, that's where their quality of life is not in running marathons anymore or even running up and down the stairs. It's having meaningful conversations with friends and loved ones and feeling independent, being able to make decisions independently, engage in conversations and the world with awareness and understanding.
I agree with you on that. And I think um, with the independence piece, you bring up a good point of um, something I think sometimes, for me, I know I struggled with that a little bit, but I think
Mm,
that's part of, um, like, I know for me, whenever I was, just one example I can think of that's probably applicable to other neurodivergents or neurotypicals as well. When I was working with my mom about um, managing my finances, and how
mm,
you mentioned earlier of, paying bills and paying taxes,
mm-hmm,
um, for me, I've stepped into that more when I was working, and now more even in the last few months of having my own place and not
mm,
living with my parents. And
Huge.
so, yeah, very huge. And so it's like, okay, yes, I am spending more because I have more bills. I have utilities, I have my trash, I have my um, property taxes, I have my, you know, I could have a mortgage or I could have a rent depending on where I'm
Mm-hmm.
living or how I'm living.
Mm-hmm.
I have my grocery bills, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have my HOA. um,
Huge. It's a
and
massive.
so it's keeping all those um, in mind when you're trying to keep track of everything you're spending and things you
Mm-hmm.
have left in the month to maybe spend, like maybe there's a doctor's appointment coming up or something like that. And you're
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, well, I have to keep track of what I've already spent and what
Mm-hmm.
I need to spend because the doctor's appointments
Mm-hmm.
are important. Um, but it's like, okay, um, it's almost like you're juggling, a lot of balls or plates at once.
And it never stops, right? It
Right.
never stops. Like that's what's so interesting about with so
Mm-hmm.
many. I think, this idea of we just have to get through X. We just have to get through
Mm,
school. We just have to get through high school or college, or we just have to get through this hard project at work, or we just have to get through this, even this hard relationship.
mm-hmm.
On the other side of it, there's a new hard thing. There's a new challenge. And our brain never stops trying.
Hopefully what you can do with these episodes on this podcast, Living with Invisible Learning Challenge, I would like to challenge you to journal about the episodes and just see what you learn from them. Or you can share about the episodes with your friends and family and see what they can learn from them. And as always, I will post the links to the articles that I use in the description of the podcasts. And please let me know if you know somebody who you think would want to be interviewed on this podcast, or if you yourself would want to be interviewed. Please email me. I have my email on my website, and I also have it pretty much pretty accessible on Facebook and Instagram through messaging as well. So you can get in contact with me in those ways.